Number the garden of forgotten roots the day my mother called me an embarrassment. I was standing in her kitchen, surrounded by dried lavender bundles she'd insisted we keep for sentimental value, while I held a bundle of wild rosemary she'd never even seen grow. She said my research on medicinal plants was primitive nonsense, and that I was wasting our family's resources on something nobody would ever use. My father had already packed his bags for the city, muttering about how I was throwing our future away. And I believed him. That night, alone in my small apartment, I stared at the ceiling and thought, this is it. This is exactly why I'm going to fail. They were right at first. For 3 years, I lived in that shadow of expectation. People at work laughed when I spoke about my garden projects. Neighbors whispered about my herbal concoctions like they were discussing a hobby rather than a calling. Even my closest friends stopped inviting me out, fearing the same judgment that followed me home. But I couldn't stop. The soil beneath my feet called to me, and I learned to listen. My departure wasn't dramatic. It was a slow erosion of everything I'd been taught to fear. I quit my job, sold my car, and moved into a rented cottage on the edge of town where the land was still wild, untamed, waiting. There, I began gathering. Not the cultivated herbs my grandmother had taught me, but the ones people had forgotten. The bitter root that could soothe inflammation, the golden leaf that brightened mood, the humble plant that could draw out toxins from the skin. I worked in secret at first, tending to these forgotten species in the cracks between concrete and steel, building what would become my community healing gardens. The ridicule didn't stop. When I presented my findings at local conferences, the same voices rose again. Why waste time on plants? They asked. It's all natural remedies. No one buys those. One professor from a prestigious university even published a paper claiming my methodology was flawed, citing lack of scientific rigor while ignoring the actual data. He accused me of being delusional, of chasing fantasies that would never yield practical results. I felt the weight of their disbelief like a physical burden, pressing down on my chest each morning before I stepped outside to tend to my growing sanctuary. But I kept planting, I kept learning. I studied botany, chemistry, ecology, all while working double shifts at a clinic where I treated patients whose conditions conventional medicine couldn't touch. I watched them suffer, and I remembered my mother's hands shaking as she explained how she'd raised me on the idea that science was the only path to dignity. I realized then that the real failure wasn't mine, it was theirs, for believing that some dreams were too strange, too impractical, too primitive to matter. Years passed. My gardens expanded. What started as a few neglected patches became thriving ecosystems, drawing people from across the region seeking relief from ailments that pharmaceuticals couldn't address. I trained others, sharing my knowledge of wildcrafting techniques that had been lost for generations. My community healing gardens became a beacon, not because they were flashy or profitable, but because they offered something precious, hope rooted in nature itself. Children came to learn about the plants that healed. Elderly neighbors returned to find solace in the scent of sage and mint. The neighborhood, once indifferent, began to care. And then, one autumn evening, my family finally came to visit. I hadn't expected them. After all these years, I thought perhaps they would have grown distant, perhaps they would have given up entirely. Instead, my mother arrived with a suitcase full of clothes and a determined expression. My father stood beside her, looking older than I remembered, carrying the same skepticism that had defined our relationship for years. They walked through the streets I'd transformed, past the gardens I'd nurtured, and stopped at the center, a circular space where dozens of people gathered weekly to share herbs, heal wounds, and reconnect with the earth. My mother's eyes swept over the vibrant displays of medicinal plants, the handmade salves, the dried flowers arranged in beautiful patterns. She paused at a table where I was preparing a tea blend for a group of children, and something shifted in her expression. The laughter I'd heard from her at other gatherings was gone, replaced by a quiet confusion that deepened into recognition. You're "You're really doing this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "All this time, you've actually made it work." My father shook his head slowly. "I don't understand. We told you it was foolish. We told you you were wasting our money." "I know," she said, and there was no defensiveness in her voice anymore, only sorrow. "I knew you wouldn't believe us, but I also knew. I knew you loved me enough to try." The truth hit me harder than any insult I'd ever received. They weren't wrong about my dream being impractical. They were simply blind to the fact that practicality meant nothing if you refused to see possibility where others saw impossibility. Their disappointment had been a wall I built around myself, and now that I'd finally emerged, they couldn't deny what I'd become. That night, as my family sat among the healing plants we'd cultivated together, I understood the full weight of my journey. Every moment of ridicule, every dismissive comment, every silent judgment had been a seed planted in my mind. But I had watered it with persistence, nurtured it with love, and watched it bloom into something far greater than I'd ever imagined possible. The ledger of my life was finally balanced, not through their approval, but through my own unwavering commitment to what I believed in. I looked at my mother and saw the tears she was trying to hold back. I looked at my father and saw the man he'd always been, stripped of his pride but revealed in his true heart. They had spent years telling me I was an embarrassment. In the end, they were the ones who had been left behind, clinging to a version of my potential that never existed. The garden thrived, the community grew stronger, and I, who had once been mocked for following a ridiculous dream, stood before them not as a failure, but as proof that sometimes the greatest revolutions begin with a single act of defiance, and that the most profound justice comes not from forgiveness, but from the courage to create something beautiful from the ashes of doubt. The ledger is closed, the garden continues,